Hello, and welcome to another edition of Sree's Sunday New York Times Read Along. Our guest is Nirmal Ghosh, author of Backlash, Donald Trump and the Remaking of America. My name is Neil Parekh. I'm the guest host today. We are live on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, YouTube, Instagram, and our Digimentors website. Please like, comment, share, retweet, do all the things you do on social media to let people know about this show. This is going to be another incredible show for us. If you've watched the last few episodes, we have talked about some of the headlines regarding President Trump 2.0, if you will. But we had Amy Vership, who is the travel editor of the New York Times, and we're focusing on 52 places to go. And then we had the CEO of a nonprofit of the John and Lillian Miles Lewis Foundation last week. So we kind of shied away. We didn't really go deep into all of the political stuff that's been going on. This week, we will be taking the gloves off, or as our friend Shashi Belamkonda said on Twitter, we might be putting the gloves on. So we will open up for all the comments, all the thoughts, all the takes you have on this second Trump administration. Before we bring on our guest and before we dive into it, just want to make a few quick announcements, and then we will get on with the show. Of course, Nirmal's book is Backlash, Donald Trump and the Remaking of America. And we want to share this quote from Stephen Herman, who's the former Voice of America White House bureau chief, former guest on the show, where he was talking about his own book, Behind the White House Curtain. Nirmal Ghosh provides a clear overview of how and why the United States has gone from Obama to Trump to Biden and back to Trump. It's a concise but compelling explanation that serves as an essential primer for readers seeking lucidity ahead of an uncertain and possibly unprecedented period of geopolitical upheaval. Nirmal's book is, he's written from the perspective of a foreign correspondent for Singapore's The Straits Times. He was there for 30 years. So he really wrote it to explain what's happening in America for an international audience. But my looking through the book, my reading through it, upside down, reading through it, it really is great for a U.S. audience as well. I think that people will get a lot out of it. It's available on Amazon starting tomorrow. So we will share that link and share that QR code again more than once. Other thoughts I want to share with you real quick. Sree's Sunday note from last week, if you happen to see it. It's only been 2 weeks, feels like 2 decades. Donald Trump's 2 weeks back in the Oval Office have been as predicted. Flood the zone, create chaos, blame everything on non-whites, immigrants, and liberals. Rinse, repeat. But this all feels different. The unreserved, barely coded racism and hate is overwhelming, all-encompassing, and on full public display. You can read Sree's Sunday note, sreenet.substack.com, and we'll share that again later as well. And we'll also share this QR code for you so that you can get that newsletter. Again, we'll be covering several issues. We'll also talk a little bit about Nirmal's background as a wildlife conservationist, as a poet. Nirmal has a broad background. What's great is that this is the second time I'm getting to interview Nirmal. This is from September 2019. Interviewed him at his house. Make note of the picture in the background because we're going to talk about that a little later. But it was incredible to have Nirmal back on the show and to cover all these issues. We are also going to share with you the Super Bowl preview from the New York Times. We don't usually spend a lot of time on sports on this show, but there's a special section, and it's available on our website. So if you go to digimentors.group/NYTReadalong, and look for Nirmal Ghosh, or scan the QR code when you see it again later. You will be able to get this PDF if you're at all interested, not just in football or sports, but graphic design and journalism and sports journalism. You'll want to check it out. I should note that the New York Times Read-Along is produced by Digimentors, the consulting firm that Sree established with his friend Andrew Lee. And we are always grateful to Muckrack for their sponsorship of the show. As we get ready to bring Nirmal on, and I'm so glad I didn't wear my pink T-shirt today. That would have been a little embarrassing. But as we get ready to bring Nirmal on, let's say hi to some of the folks that are watching. Calvary Madhavan, a former guest from Ireland, is saying hi to myself and Nirmal. Jonathan, greetings from a snowy East Village. Patricia Grayson, greetings from New York. Naomi Service, snowy good morning from Rhode Island. Keep those gloves on. Shared with friends. Thank you, Naomi. Diane says good morning. My mom is saying good morning from Tampa with Rochelle and Steve, our friends from Hastings on Hudson, our neighbors. They are visiting from New York. So thank you so much. Ken Fisher saying good morning from Iowa. Patricia offering a welcome to Nirmal. And Calvary says we'll be listening very carefully to this gloves off conversation. For us in Europe, to be forearmed is forewarned. We have so much to be anxious about. We do too, Calvary. Diane is saying good morning from Margate. Really looking forward to what insight our guests can give us and how we can get out of this mess. I know Sree included some pointers on how to get out of the mess. I don't know how much we'll focus on how to get out. That might be a whole different show that we have to do. But at least let's take an assessment of where things are right now. John Lee, greetings, Neil. Tough topics today. Not enjoying the parallel universe we seem to have slipped into. Agree. Carol King is watching from Tampa Bay as well. Carol, thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate it. Deborah Kerr, watching from Fort Lauderdale, and now is as good a time as any to mention that Deborah will be our guest February 23rd. So we don't have a show next week because it's President's Day. But after that, Deborah Kerr will be joining us. She just recently finished a trip to Antarctica, sponsored by National Geographic. So we will be looking forward to seeing her pictures, video, and more. It's a great follow-up to our show with Amy Vership, 52 Places to Go. And the final few final comments, we have Trish Connors and Jelly joining us. Trish, always great to have you. Thank you. And Atul Tolia, my uncle from Toronto, is saying good morning. And from the 51st, that hasn't happened yet, Atul Mama, my uncle. So not yet. And then Miriam Berkeley saying good morning from Hell's Kitchen, snowy and cold. So as we get ready to bring Nirmal on, I do want to start with a first question. What is the policy or announcement or directive from President Trump that has gotten your attention the most? There's comments on Gaza, USAID, the Treasury Department, Elon Musk, Greenland, Panama Canal. The list goes on and on. The resignations, that kind of encouragement of resignations from federal workers, the ending of grant funding and science funding. What is the one thing that has gotten your attention? And feel free if you want to explain why very briefly, but at least just name the one thing, and then we'll bring Nirmal on. As I mentioned, Nirmal Ghosh is our guest. He is the author of Backlash, Donald Trump and the Remaking of America. And we are looking forward to this conversation. Nirmal, welcome to the show.
Hi.
How are you doing, Nirmal? Good to see you.
Neil, good to see you. Good to see you. Thank you for having me back on again. Great to see you again. Last time we met was in my apartment. It seems like a lifetime ago, actually.
Yeah, it was. I mean, that was in the before times, before
Yeah,
COVID. We were doing these
indeed.
shows. You were in Washington D.C. You were
Right.
serving as the Washington correspondent for Straits
Yeah.
Times,
Yeah.
and we had a chance to meet in person, to look at your apartment, look at the artwork. It was just a great time we had that day.
What a ride.
And
What a ride it was after that.
yes, definitely, definitely. So tell us now, where are you now?
I'm in northern Thailand, actually. I'm based in Thailand. I was Indochina bureau chief for 13 years prior to my DC posting, and I lived here for 13 years. So it's kind of like home, and I'm familiar with it. So I'm back in Thailand, and I've been here just over a year since leaving DC.
But and you don't live in Thailand. I mean, you don't live in Singapore, but you go there often, correct?
Yeah, I'm a permanent resident of Singapore, so I go in and out, but I spend most of my time in Thailand. But I've traveled a lot. I mean, since I'm being back in the region, I have conservation work in India, so I travel to India a lot. I go to the US, to Singapore a lot. Wow, that's my old apartment. You're
Yeah,
giving
right.
me serious deja vu, man.
It's really great to see. I want to see if we can play the video here. That's just the opening shot. But we will get the video going in just a moment.
Way to give you an outdoor
There we
shot.
go.
We're doing an interior shot today. We're at the home of the
Oops.
U.S. Bureau Chief for the Straits Times, Nirmal Ghosh, and I'm
So
coming
that
around
was
the corner
the opening.
to see Nirmal. Hello,
and
Nirmal. How are you doing?
there's you. So
Thank
tell
you
us
for
about.
joining
There's
us,
that painting
early this morning
right?
on a Sunday.
Right above you.
Yep.
We have a number of people joining
Tell
us.
us about that.
I wanted to start with.
About the painting?
Yeah.
Yeah, so the painting is it's actually, I grew up since I was a little with this. There's a print of a painting by David Shepard, who was one of my dad's favorite painters. He is David Shepard is famous for his natural history, his wildlife paintings. He's an amazing painter, and I've got a few others of his pieces. Some of them have been signed, and this is called Elephants at Amboseli, and it's always been part of my home wherever I am, since he died. He passed away in 2015. So I lugged it over, and I take it wherever I am, and it just reminds me, of him and of the passage of time and elephants.
And that's it right behind
Exactly.
you. Tell us in terms of the I mean, having this kind of painting, having this kind of the artwork that we saw in your apartment before, with your moving around between doing other foreign postings, coming to the US, going back. Talk a little bit, before we talk about the politics, talk a little bit about, what it is like to move around so much, and what you get to keep, what you don't do. Do you put everything in storage, or are you constantly cleaning through and purging and that kind of thing?
No, that's a very good question. I kind of recreate my home and make a home wherever I am. And moving is always a little wrenching because it's like leaving home all over again. And I've done that several times. But I do try and take treasure things like certain artworks, my books, of course, and rugs and lamps and this and that. I like creating an ambience, and an ambience of home, a cozy home, and I do that. Some of the stuff stays in boxes. I've got some boxes lying around here, unpacked. But I have a small living room here, which I wish I could show you, but I'm sort of grounded here. But it is sort of recreates that DC ambience, which recreated my earlier Bangkok ambience. And I take great comfort in that. It makes me feel grounded and at home when you carry the familiar things around with you. Artworks. I know you're not supposed to be attached to these things, of course. That's but it makes me feel nice, so I carry them around as much as I can. But some I give away when I move, or some I give away to friends.
And we can't. I mean, that's an aspirational goal, not to be tied to material things, of
Yeah.
course. In terms of for a Buddhist perspective, do you practice Buddhism? Is that where that came from, or just a general? You shouldn't be tied to.
Yeah, I'm kind of an aspiring Buddhist. I think Buddhism is something one aspires to. So that's where I'm at.
Certainly. So I put the prompt on the screen for folks who are watching. Let us know what is the the policy announcement that you've seen from Trump 2.0 that has gotten the most attention for you, that's kind of gotten into your mind, and we'll explore some of that in a little bit. We have a few answers that have already come in. We'll wait for a few more. Rose Harwitz is watching from Connecticut. Thank you, Rose. And we have a mutual friend, Steve Herman, who had the quote on the blurb on your book. We had the chance to interview Steve in person just, I think, before we did your interview. And we interviewed him last June when his book Behind the White House Curtain came out. He says the Marquis de Lafayette was America's first great outside chronicler. Whoa, I see where he's going. And Nirmal Ghosh, despite not being a French aristocrat, follows in that tradition.
I'll take the compliment if that is one.
I will stop the show right here. I think we're done. Like, I don't know what else we need to say after this. But I will take that ticker off. Nirmal, go ahead and take a screenshot with that quote from Steve. Oh my God, that's a keeper. Steve, you're great. Thank you so much for watching. This is great. And my mom points out that Jainism also talks about the same philosophy in terms of not being attached to material things. So let's turn our attention to Trump 2.0, as I'm going to shortcut it for our conversation. A few of the initial comments that came in, Naomi is talking about his revolting cabinet picks, and there certainly are a number of those. I think that we saw some in 2016. These are even worse, I think. Jonathan references Elon Musk and his hacking of government systems in both senses of the phrase. Certainly can attest to that. And so those, and then John Lee, something about his takeover of the Kennedy Center grabbed me, revealing how deep, petty, and self-aggrandizing this thing is going to be. So we want people to put in more of your thoughts, more of your comments about what is the policy announcement that has really gotten your attention. But let's take a step back, Nirmal. Your book takes a look at the rise of Trump and go back to 2016 and the resurgence in 2024. What do you see are some of the key factors that laid the groundwork for Trump?
Right. So basically, I think it's important to understand why he came to power in 2016 in the first place. That explains 2024. 2024 is basically Trump, 2.0, literally, on steroids. So if you look at, so my book basically explores the proximate factors and also the long-term inherent contradictions or paradoxes within the United States. So there was tremendous job loss in starting with, like if you can go back to Seattle 1999. If you remember, November, Seattle 1999, WTO meeting, globalized free trade was on the agenda. Tens of thousands of people were filling the streets protesting against them. International NGOs, students, farmers unions, the works, everybody was in the streets. They did not want that agenda, right? And that was already underway. Job losses were already happening in the American heartland, in the manufacturing heartland. What happened at those protests? They were tear gassed, they were rubber bulleted, the globalization free trade agenda was rammed down their throats, right? Then came job losses from shutdown of coal mines under the Barack Obama administration, right? So you had like 2 decades of job losses and hollowing out America's industrial base, right? And then came the 2008 recession. Who bailed out? The big corporates. It was Barack Obama, right? So there's a tremendous disillusionment sank into middle America. The American dream became sort of out of reach. A lot of these small towns, and I've been to the small towns, you have to go beyond the cities. You have to go 2 hours outside the cities, 2 hours inside from the coast and see what the reality is, which is, disused factories, abandoned parking lots, people on opioids, misery, basically real misery, right? And so there was disillusionment with the political class, both Republican and Democrat. And the ground was ripe It took 20 years to build up, but the ground was ripe for a sort of maverick outsider like Trump. And remember, Trump was from Queens, right? He was being made fun of by, in, in the talk shows by the Manhattan for a long time. But he was at the same time a household name. And I went to look back at a Steve Bannon interview, which he gave in Frontline PBS in 2017, I think it was, in which he said that when Trump first talked about, running for president, Bannon was dragged along to see him by some mutual friend. And Bannon was skeptical, but when Trump walked in, he said, wow, Trump, the charisma of this man, he owns the room, and he is an imperfect weapon, but he is an armor-piercing shell. So Trump was the weapon, and he basically poured gasoline on long smoldering discontent in America with progressive, with the gains of progressive, same-sex marriage, wedding cakes for same-sex couples, transgender bath toilets, the whole progressive agenda, right? All that stuff built up, and then the old favorite, right? Scaremongering about immigrants. Now, America has had waves of this kind of stuff, which has been going on for ages. Like, prejudice against Italians, against Catholics, against the Irish, against the Japanese, against the Chinese, now against the Indians, right? So this has been carrying on and on for a long time. And, all it needs is a hugely charismatic, populist demagogue to come along and stoke the flames that are already there. And that's what Trump did. And the time was ripe. It was, I hate to use the phrase, it's overused, but it's tempting to use it again. It was a perfect storm. You had tremendous discontent in the so-called flyover states, and you had liberal coastal elites. And one of the takeaways from my time in America, which I try and write about in the book, is that we are all in our own bubbles. And often we don't even understand how insidious the bubble is. We don't even know we are in our bubbles, right? All you have to do is step outside and you see a completely different world. And it's not unique to America. It's in other countries as well. You step off the highway in UP in India, you step 100 miles off the highway, it's like going back half a century in time. It's a completely different country, right? So these are some of the things that I've tried to bring out in Backlash to explain, because I found, and in my conversations in the lead up to the book, I found a lot of people were puzzled, not just puzzled, but dismayed and distraught at how someone like Donald Trump could rise to power. How on earth Americans would vote this man to power, right? And the problem is that now we've been overwhelmed by social media and quick hot takes of TikTok and whatnot. And there's a loss of sense of context, of history, of cause and effect. If we are to learn to history, we have to understand cause and effect. So this is one of the things that I tried to bring out in the book.
You also spent a lot of time, in terms of all these issues that you're talking about, going back to the WTO, going back to the opioid crisis, etc. But you spent quite a bit of time in the book on the scourge, the epidemic of gun violence in the U.S. And mentioning all of the big, spending time talking about Sandy Hook, about Columbine, etc. Things that are almost, I think for some people, are almost distant memories now. We have a whole generation that has grown up since then. But talk a little bit more about the emphasis on gun violence and the role that played in this history.
Yeah, well, of course, the gun violence in America has always intrigued people outside America, and it's dismayed a lot of Americans. And America is fairly unique in that sense, in terms of gun rights. Everybody can own a citizen can own a gun. So there were several mass shootings. There always are mass shootings in America, and there were some particularly horrific ones while I was there. And I found this is constant chorus of hand wringing, from the White House. It's like thoughts and prayers, and this is un-American. But then I thought, look, this is very American. A lot of people have guns. I was in my condo when I heard gunshots. There was a bullet hole in one of the ground floor apartments of my condo from a stray bullet one night, So this is part of America. You can live in America for years and not see someone actually discharge a gun in front of your eyes. But guns are always a part of life in America. And I remember one episode I mentioned in my book, and it was in winter, it was in Kentucky. And I was looking for a woman I wanted to interview for a story, and I had her address, but she wasn't responding to her mobile. So I drove out with a local photographer. I drove out to her place, and it was a big place, in a remote countryside. And there was a driveway, and it has a no trespassing sign on the gate. But there were 3 or 4 cars, so there were people home. And I pulled up outside, and I asked the photographer. I said, "What do you think?" So she said, "I wouldn't go in because everybody here has guns." So I sort of gave up on that. And then I realized that if I lived in a place like that, in the middle of rural Kentucky, I might also want to have a gun handy. It is, and guns are a part of the DNA of America. There's no wishing it away, but it's also part of the culture wars, and it's a great bone of contention, and it's in the Constitution, and it's just what America is. And of course, um, the Democrats and Republicans there's a massive divide in terms of gun ownership, data, and attitude towards gun control and gun ownership between the two parties, the two extremes. So it was an obvious part of the culture wars that plays a part. And Trump is a great, his supporters say guns, God, and Trump. They have banners saying guns, God, and Trump, right? So, there you go. I thought it was worth getting into that because it intrigues people outside America. They don't get it,
It intrigues people inside America as well. I mean, that's why I think that the book, written ostensibly for an international audience, is just as important, just as effective for a U.S. audience. It really is trying to understand what is going on and why. Again, the book is Backlash, Donald Trump and the Remaking of America. It'll be available on Amazon in the U.S. starting tomorrow, February 10th. So we've shared that link with folks, and we certainly encourage you to get it. It was released in print in Singapore earlier, right? Just after the inauguration.
That's right, just before the inauguration. Yeah.
Before. So tell us a little bit about the timing of that, Nirmal, in terms of this kind of book doesn't happen overnight, right? When did you, just for the process, so people kind of understand, when did you first think about writing a book like this? When did you finish it and go to press so that it was ready just around, before inauguration, in print in Singapore, now February 10th on Amazon? Talk us through that process a little bit.
Right. Yeah. So basically, when I got back to Asia after leaving DC in December 23, I dropped into Singapore sometime in the early summer last year, and I met Ambassador at Large, Professor Tommy Koh, who, as we know, is one of Singapore's most senior diplomats, and he's always been a friend and mentor to me for a long time. And we were chatting about Trump and the upcoming election in America and all that. And he said, "You must write a book." So I told him, I said, "Look, I've thought about writing a book, but I gave up on it because I think there's going to be lots of books on Trump and all that." And he said, no, you must write a book because nobody understands what's going on in America. And then I had to actually agree with him because I had just given a talk at the American Chamber in Singapore, where I started with that, saying that, few people understand what's going on. They don't understand the rise of Trump. They cannot comprehend the rise of Trump. And then I thought maybe it's a good idea, and it's an important juncture in world history, in international geopolitics. We need to understand what's going on in America. We need to understand this cause and effect. What gives rise to a person like Trump? So I said, okay. And he called his publisher and said, you published this book. I couldn't walk away. So I said, all right. And I had subsequently about 4 months to write the book. And I talked to the publisher, and we figured that the best time to release the book would be during or just after the election. Now, the problem was that we didn't know what was going to happen in the election. If it was going to be a disputed election, then certain things would have to be revised in the book and so on and so forth. So there were all kinds of unknown factors. But I decided to take the long view, not get bogged down in day-to-day stuff. I decided to talk about the trends I had mentioned earlier, long-term trends in America, explaining the recent history, the proximate causes, and the underlying factors, sounding like a doctor, really. And then write the last chapter, like an afterword after the election, and publish it as soon as possible after that. So that was the plan. And I wrote the whole thing in about 4 months. And after that, after the election, I did a quick trip back to New York. I hung out a bit with my daughter who lives in New York, and I did a very quick trip to DC, and just to get the feel of it, get into that headspace. And I wrote that afterward. And they did a very quick job. 90% of the book was ready by then, and they released it just before the election, when Trump and America was at the top of the news cycle. That was the idea, and we managed to do it, at least for the Singapore market. It's coming out slightly little later in other markets.
Sure, of course. But that's interesting in terms of how you work through that timing. A few other comments that people had in terms of what they were looking at. First of all, Doug said earlier that is a perfect explanation of the environment that made it possible for Trump to get attention and power when you were kind of working through that history. Deborah Kerr says ICE has come onto school grounds without warrants in South Florida. School boards have said no access without proper warrant. ICE has been going into communities for deportation. I've heard the comment, we didn't think he'd do it. South Florida's Hispanic community voted for Trump and our 2 GOP senators. Now they're finding out what that vote may have cost them. Certainly some buyer's remorse out there. Harish Mehta is watching on YouTube and has a question. I cannot think of another U.S. president in the 20th century who divided the country in the way Trump has. What's your take?
Which one do you want me to respond to? The last one?
Yeah, please.
So
I mean, either
which
one do you want to talk about ICE, or you want to talk about?
I think Harish is right. Harish is right. I have never seen. America's been through a lot, right? I mean, the Vietnam War and all that. It's been through a lot. I mean, let's just leave the Civil War aside. But in recent history, it's been through the Vietnam War, the Iraq, all these events, the Iraq invasion, Afghanistan, the 9/11 attacks. In the 9/11 attacks, the nation came together. But subsequently, so that was a very brief moment of togetherness. And then they got bogged down in Afghanistan. The whole world opinion was with America. They went to Afghanistan, did the job, and then they got stuck in Afghanistan. And there was this joke in the Taliban, right? That the Americans have watches, but we have the time. And look what happened in the end, right? The middle has fallen out of American politics. And when I was there, I saw it getting steadily more toxic. And one of the academics I reference in the book is Amy Chua from Yale, who's a great friend of mine. And she put it to me very interestingly. She said that, in America, the political divide is beginning to resemble ethnic divides in older societies. And I noticed that getting more and more toxic. You cannot even start a conversation in public, in a social setting rather, without feeling out first with strangers, like what side they are on, right? People have had this problem in families. And if you look at data from dating sites, more and more young people don't want to date people who with different political beliefs. So the divide is getting worse and worse and worse and more toxic. And I think Trump, too, is going to make it even worse.
I think one of the other examples of that, they mentioned South Florida, Deborah did in her comments about ICE, but it's also the Arab community, in particular in Dearborn. I mean, it was the first time that I think a Republican had won Dearborn, a large Arab American community. And, after the comments about Gaza, about taking over Gaza, there were reports that they had said, we're going to change our name. They're just dumbfounded that he would do this. Deborah also mentions, talking about the work on gun violence, David Hogg. I saw this on the news. Survivor of the Parkland massacre, Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School, was elected a VP of the DNC. And February 14th, coming up on Friday, is the anniversary of that shooting. So that's certainly a huge thing. Diane says combating disinformation is another issue, and the attack on public health in the scientific community, that's certainly been an issue. And my mom has a comment. I'm going to read this at Nirmal, autocorrect. I don't know if you've gotten this before, Nirmal to normal, but when you were in Singapore, whether you were there in Singapore a few years ago when the Pravasi Bharatiya Divas was there in Singapore?
No, I wasn't
know
there.
about, there was some kind of conference, I guess.
Yeah, I guess so. I know.
There.
Unfortunately, I wasn't there. Yeah, sounds
Absolutely.
interesting.
Absolutely.
Mm.
And I think that the one thing to kind of make note of, I mean, like it's every day, and as Sree mentioned in his newsletter, the flood the zone kind of approach, right? So I want to put that back up on screen for folks and give you a chance to get that QR code, and we'll put the link as well. But his 2 weeks, his first 2 weeks, he wrote this last week, was a flood the zone strategy, create chaos, etc. So you can read Sree's newsletter at sreenet.substack.com, sreenet.substack.com. We will put that on the screen for you, or you can hit that QR code to go directly to this week's or last week's edition. But it certainly is, and that image of Elon Musk on the cover. What's your take on Elon Musk and the role that he's playing?
Yeah, well, I think this is what we are seeing is oligarchy essentially, and peak capitalist oligarchy, right? The marriage of corporate and political power, and it's unfortunate. It's new kind. It's a new kind of combination of power, which is tech based, right? I mean, the weapons are technology and digital and data, right? It's not an old fashioned, like, roll the tanks into the streets and seize power kind of thing. It's a very different kind of seizure of key aspects of our lives, right? And aspects of our lives which, by the way, we've given up quite willingly in recent years. I mean, all our entire lives are now in this one little device, and it's easy to take it over and take over the digital record. So it's a very new kind of thing which we're grappling with, but basically it's also an old-fashioned oligarchy. And going back to Steve Bannon's remarks in Frontline in that PBS interview, he made the remark. He said that he talked about the 2008 recession, and he said that after a blow of that magnitude, it often ends up in a variety of fascism, right? What happens eventually? History tells us. And if you go back to 1999 Seattle, November 99 in Seattle, there was a guy, I think his name was Sellers. He was an activist. He joined Greenpeace later and whatnot. But he rappelled up a crane, one of those construction cranes, and he unfurled this banner in which he said there was a street sign. One way led to WTO and the other way led to democracy. So I thought that was such a chillingly prescient, image to unfold at that time. Nobody got it, but it also shows how even democratically elected governments, once you get into power, the sort of power elites ignore the people. If you have a functioning democracy like the US has, the blowback will come through the popular vote. If you don't have a functioning democracy, it'll come through an uprising or a revolution. So you cannot say that democracy is not working in the US. You can say there's a retrenchment or a recession in liberal democracy, in a particular brand of democracy, and that's worldwide, not just in the US, but in many parts of the world, as we know.
Sure.
But it was a functional democracy that got Trump into power twice. You remember that.
And that was also, I mean, if you draw the parallels, and I think Elon Musk's salute at that event parallels to Weimar Germany. It was a democratic republic. It was the democratic institutions were in place, before
Yeah.
Hitler was able to rise to power.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
You're talking about the role of democracy in all of this. Contrast that a little bit. You're in Thailand, but contrast that to Singapore, where you travel back a lot, and the way the government is organized there. You wouldn't see this happen in Singapore.
No, so basically, I mean, I don't cover Singapore day to day, and
No,
I'm not
no.
familiar with Singapore. I haven't for many years. But if you look at Southeast Asia writ large, you have many kinds of dispensations. I'm sitting in a monarchy, right? Thailand. It's a monarchy. Yes, it's a constitutional monarch, but it's one step backward. They have elections, one step backward, one step forward, two steps back. One step forward,
Mhm.
two steps back. Then right next door, you have Laos, communist, Vietnam, communist. You have Myanmar in the civil war, right? Again, one step forward, two steps back.
Mm.
Then you have Indonesia, which is secular democracy. Singapore, which is sort of, what they call it, a nanny state democracy and all that. But it's a stable place. And then if you look at China, now this is interesting. And we had this discussion in Singapore at the launch of my book with Professor Wang Gangwu of NUS. He made an interesting point. He said, watching the US from China's perspective, it just confirms to China that they don't want this sort of whipsawing and unpredictability. It just confirms that this system is not for them. Because in Southeast Asia, which is China and Southeast Asia, Southeast Asia has been the victim of proxy conflict between great powers, right? It was hammered in World War II. It was hammered in the Indochina Wars and Cold War, right? In the proxy wars. Southeast Asia also prizes stability and continuity. China prizes the same thing. So the priorities are different, which is one of the reasons why the whole rhetoric about democracy versus authoritarianism and all that kind of stuff, which was coming out of which comes regularly out of the White House, and it comes out of the Biden regime. It came out of the Biden regime, doesn't really sit well in Southeast Asia because they have many forms of government, and suited to their own particular circumstances. And it's not a binary view of the world. This is why also Southeast, you hear this continuing chorus from Southeast Asia, don't make us choose between China and the US. And this is something I feel I've talked about before in the US. It's also, the US worldview is very binary. You're with us or you're against us. If
Yeah.
we see a problem,
sure.
and I have a whole chapter in the book on this. If we see a problem, we want to fix it. We want to fix the world to the benefit of the US, to the advantage of the US. That is not the attitude of Southeast Asia or Asia in general. Southeast Asia sort of is more fluid. It works in the spaces between many cultures. Southeast Asia is a confluence of cultures, of empires, dating back centuries, and is used to managing apparent paradoxes in a sort of fluid way. Now you may call it hypocrisy in some cases. You might call it ineffective. I mentioned to a friend of mine who was a former Thai ambassador, I mentioned this idea to him, and he said, yeah, well, I wish we had some more of the US can do fix it attitude here, because then we would function better. And so, we had a laugh over that. But the fact is, it's different in Southeast Asia. The whole way of managing conflict and stuff is different. You find an obstacle, you find an intractable obstacle. You don't attack it head on like the US would probably do. Invade a country. You can't do that. In Southeast Asia, you go around it. You sort of negotiate. You talk behind the scenes. You sweep it under the carpet, even for the greater good, so to speak, right? So it's a different way of doing things in Southeast Asia, and again, they prize stability. And Singapore has been a stable place for a very long time and has managed
Sure.
to play a very, very adept balancing act. China is right next door to us in Southeast Asia. We cannot wish that away. It's geography, right? But the US is still appreciated as a major power and an offshore balancer, which is essential to maintain a balance of power in the region, essentially, because there are many disputes, as we know, in the South China Sea
Sure,
and all that kind
sure.
of stuff, right? So we need the US to be there as a friendly offshore balancer to China, to a rising China. But have to coexist with both powers. That's the position of Southeast Asia.
So we have a few more comments we want to bring in. Mary C. Curtis, who is a columnist with CQ Roll Call and a commentator based in North Carolina, former guest on the show, friend of both mine and Sree's. Many Americans have never believed in multiracial democracy. They are expressing this out loud, even louder, I think, now than in 2016 when Trump was first elected, with a leader who clearly believes straight white men should rule. You wrote about this in the book in terms of it's almost like a backlash against the 8 years of Obama, in terms of, for progressives, for this idea that there was some movement beyond racism, to have the first African-American president. And this clearly is a backlash to that. Can you speak to these issues?
Yeah, I know. I totally agree with Mary out there. And this is the inherent paradox of America, right? It's an immigrant society, and it depends on immigrants to maintain its economic edge, its innovation edge, its vibrancy is dependent on immigrants. Silicon Valley is the prime example, but there are many others all across the country. But then what you get rising numbers of other people, other races, other ethnicities. And by 2045 or thereabouts, white people will become just another group, no longer the majority. Now that weighs heavily, I think, on people of the ilk of, those that Mary talks about, who actually don't believe in genuine multiracialism. I mean, America's a melting pot, but the diversity of places like, again, Southeast Asia is much more organic. It goes back centuries. Whereas in America, it's something new. And this is what, the title of my book, Backlash, is taken from a quote from Seymour Martin Lipset. And he wrote an essay back in 1968, I think it was, or 69, about him in this book called American Prejudice, and in which he talks about, again, the waves of prejudice against immigrants. And there's always this fear that the American way of life is going to be destroyed by others, other people of other races, other religions, other values, and so forth. And a populist demagogue politician will happily stoke that. And
Sure.
But now it's becoming a little more serious because of this 2045 watershed, which is looming. So this is an inherent paradox, and I don't think America has figured out how to manage it. Now, Trump is trying to. It's a bit of a corrective to that, as Mary is saying. Trump represents a return to the patriarchy, in one way. It's a reversion to Christian nationalism. If you notice, the faith office in the White House, the laying of hands of the pastors on Trump, the whole separation of church and state has become a little bit fuzzy in the U.S., right?
Very fuzzy.
Right. And so we have a regime with overtones of white Christian nationalism, and it's going to be very tough to navigate because it is antithetical to the nature of America, and whose creative and innovative and economic engine hums along, largely powered by immigrants, white immigrants, brown immigrants, from wherever, but basically it's an immigrant nation, right? So this is a paradox America is trapped in, right? So I honestly, I don't see how it's going to pan out, but it's very disturbing.
And I want to say Jonathan had a slight modification of what Mary said, not just straight white men, but straight white Christian men specifically. And so I think that's a good point.
Right.
We have, let's see what else that we can bring in. Did Naomi says Trump and his minions hate the free press, considers it a real enemy. That's been very clear. Patricia is asking, did your perspective change? Perspective in hindsight change writing this last book? You were here. You experienced. You covered Trump 1.0, the first edition, and then as you started working on this book and thinking about the resurgence and actually looking at the history, did this impact your thinking? Did it evolve in terms of what your experience was that first time? Did you just build on that experience?
Yeah, well, not really. It didn't impact my thinking in hindsight much. I have to say, I kind of expected it. Now, I read Project 2025 when it first came out, right? And one had seen how Trump behaved. And when it's, you have to take Trump at face value, what he means, what he says. He throws a lot of stuff at the wall, but a lot of it sticks. And some of the stuff he says has a grain of truth in it, right? And his base loves it. So he's got this very loyal base. And I've been with his loyalists in his rallies and talked to them. And it's a massive following with a massive momentum. And we saw that. So I don't think my opinion changed. What I noticed was that even 8 years later, no one was quite prepared for how fast they would move. The Trump 2 administration would move. No one was quite prepared for it. And going back to another question, which you just referenced about the media.
Yes.
The fact, and someone, talked about his, I think, cabinet appointees earlier.
Yes.
And this is a perfect example of the incestuous nature, right, of corporate media and the administration, especially. And it's out in the open now. I mean, the mask has been torn off, right? You have, former Fox News hosts, with, not really qualified, to put it mildly, in charge of the entire Defense Department. So it's that incestuous cycle is open for everyone to see, right? So I think if you read Project 2025, because going back to the bubbles we live in, we kind of think it's not going to happen. We kind of say to ourselves, he can't do this. He can't be serious. You keep hearing this. Like I heard this just yesterday. He can't be serious. How much of this is actually doable? Yes, a lot of it is not possibly doable. He's getting pushed back. He's getting a lot of judges halting his orders, temporarily halting his orders. But that to his base shows that the sort of deep state bureaucratic establishment is fighting back against his agenda, right? So he's giving the orders. So he's fulfilling his electoral promises to his base. And his base is pretty big. I mean, he ran the table, right? He got the popular vote and the electoral college. So you can't complain. You can't say, well,
but it wasn't the popular vote wasn't the electoral vote was bigger. The margin wasn't as big in terms of the total number of voters this year.
Yeah. It wasn't big, but it was decisive enough. Yeah. And so I think people still hadn't grasped how fast they would move. Well, that was the whole basis of Project 2025. That they believed, the team believed that they had not moved fast enough and decisively enough in Trump 1. And the next time around, if he was elected, they would not make that mistake again. So that's what they've done, And I think it still came as a massive shock to people because a lot of us underestimated it because, again, we habitually think, maybe it's not going to happen. It can't be. It can't be. It can't be happening. There's going to be pushback. This is America. Branches of government, checks and balances. But he's going to dismantle the total. They're going to dismantle the whole government agency, the USAID, which I think, by the way, to me, that's one of the biggest stories. Gaza and all that. Yes, but USAID is a big story.
And we'll get to the paper in just a moment. That's actually the lead article, the display photo. I want to ask folks who are watching and running the ticker across the bottom, what's one word to describe your thoughts about Trump 2.0? As we wrap up this first part of the discussion with Nirmal, what's one word to sum up your thoughts, your assessment of the first 3 weeks of Trump 2.0? We have another comment from Mary. A certain kind of Christianity is favored. So, let's get even more specific. Not that of the DC Episcopal bishops' plea for empathy. Absolutely. And on the press, Trump is calling for journalists to be fired by name, including Mary's former colleague, Eugene Robinson of the Washington Post. Absolutely. Certainly understand that. We have a few of these one-word answers coming in, so keep them coming. I do want to ask, Atul is watching, and I'm going to ask him to rephrase the question just so we understand exactly what he's asking. He's hoping that your book is not coming through Southeast Asian colored glasses. The Trump mania of American friends is affecting global minds. hearts and lives. So I'll ask him to just kind of clarify what he's asking about. I will say that there is a concern in terms of Trump mania, people focused on Trump in the U.S., elsewhere, but at least in the U.S., I mean, I can't speak to the rest of the world. I think that the rest of the world does have to worry about. We're going to talk about Mexico. We're going to talk about Canada and tariffs. When Trump says something, folks in Panama and Greenland have to be thinking about what is this actually going to mean? Is he going to follow through on these thoughts? But for the folks in the U.S., government employees, I have friends of mine who work for the government, who are in the military, who are just going bonkers with these pronouncements. I worked on a USAID project in Egypt 20 years ago. I've worked with the labor union. I've worked with nonprofits. United Way gets a lot of government funding. They have the emergency food and shelter program, and that whole program. Like a friend of mine got a message at 4:00 on a Friday saying that you need to stop work. Everything is shut down. And at 5:30, they were said you could start working again because the judge had issued an injunction, et cetera. I mean, it is really messing with people's minds. So I don't think you can overstate the impact of every pronouncement, every executive order. And as Sree has said several times, the cruelty is the purpose. That's the point. The cruelty is the point of what he's doing. It's not just an exercise. There's some real vindictiveness. It's a purge.
It's a purge. It's an old-fashioned purge, except you don't march people out into the streets, but it's a purge. Yeah, absolutely.
A couple of words that people are sharing. And Patricia, one word to describe your thoughts about Trump 2.0 is transparency. And that is an interesting take in that he is being very upfront about what he's doing. He's not, hiding. He's not using coded language. He's really, being very explicit about who his enemies are, who he's going after, what countries he's targeting. My mom, Sudha Parekh, says earthquake is her word. Kaveri says chaos. Rose says oligarchy. Absolutely. And Sree made a point on a show recently about how when you looked at the inauguration, the tech bros that were behind Trump, the Jeff Bezos, the Mark Zuckerberg, Elon Musk, even Sam Altman has found a way in as well. Those are all those tech. Mark Andreessen, I believe, as well. Diana Rahini is watching from the San Francisco Bay Area. Diana, if you have a chance to put in your one word to describe your thoughts about Trump 2.0, that would be great. My mom also offered psychopath, which I think works. Deborah says hurricane Trump, and deplorable, sadist. This is some real strong views from folks. We're loving it. Naomi, horror is her thought. Steve Herman says it's been said that those on both the left and the right prefer an America not being a melting pot, but rather in salad bowl. And that is actually, Steve, I'll take a moment on that because that is actually my understanding, my appreciation for the evolution of the immigrant experience and America. That yes, initially, if you go back to the late 1800s and the big immigration from Europe and southern Europe and Eastern Europe, the intention was a melting pot. People intentionally wanted people to lose their ethnic and cultural heritage and to become American, become more white, to be more like the majority, and foreign language, foreign customs, foreign dress were all de-emphasized. My understanding, at least growing up in the States as the son of immigrants, born and raised here, that a salad bowl was actually a more preferred approach where you keep your identity, but that you're all part of the same milieu.
You coexist
Sree likes
peacefully.
to quote, say again?
You coexist peacefully, basically.
Coexist peacefully. Sree likes to quote John Lewis saying that we may have come here on different boats, but we're all in the same ship now. right?
Yep.
I may have botched it. Maybe different ships. We're all in the same boat now. But there's that sense of identity that you want to retain. The other, Mary C. Curtis says malicious. Diana does have a word. I'm not sure how to pronounce it. Symbol, not PG friendly. Absolutely. Atul Toya says Hitlerist bully and Nazis. So we certainly have some strong feelings about that. Nirmal, thank you so much for walking us through this. We're going to stay with Trump as we look at the newspaper and all the headlines that are coming up, because they all relate to this. But before we make that switch, I do want to share with folks a little bit more of a perspective on you as a person, beyond Trump, beyond your work as a foreign correspondent. You are also a wildlife conservationist, a poet. You're a board member for a really great organization. Let's start with this picture. It's from an event that took place a few years ago. Tell us what's going on here.
Yeah, this was it's a lovely picture you brought up. This is the opening of my poetry installation at the Chinese American Museum in DC. And I write poetry, and I got my poetry translated into Chinese by the lady to my left, who is based in New York, actually, lives in Brooklyn, Liu Ivy Chen. And my daughter, who's on my right in the redder sort of outfit, is Tanya, and she's a retouch artist and an artist, and she lives in New York as well. And she did the design and production, and the calligraphy was done in traditional Chinese calligraphy by an artist in China. And the whole idea was to turn poetry into something visual and have it an installation. And this was at a time when this is just post-COVID, and there was a lot of anti-Chinese sentiment all over the place because Trump was playing it up, the China virus, and all that kind of stuff. So I thought it was like, this is to bring out the beauty of traditional Chinese calligraphy. And I have taken a lot of inspiration from poetry translations from Chinese and Japanese into English. So I thought, reverse the process. And it worked beautifully. And Chinese American Museum in DC, which is a lovely little museum, they loved it and they ran it. It was up there for 6 months. So, and that's a picture from the opening, actually.
That's great. That's great. You are also a conservationist. You're on the board for the Corbett Foundation. Tell us a little bit about the Corbett Foundation.
Yeah, so the Corbett Foundation, we work in about 5 habitats in India: Kaziranga, Northeast India, and Assam. We work in Corbett Park, where we started, and we work in habitats in central India and in western India and Kutch, the grasslands of Kutch, which is that picture over there. That bird in that picture is the great Indian bustard, one of the most endangered birds in the world. It's the tallest flying, it's the heaviest flying bird in the world. It's about 2-3 feet tall. It's a huge bird. And there are less than 200 left in the wild, because the grasslands have basically been disappearing. So we work on community relations, mitigating human wildlife conflict, with villagers who live in the periphery of national parks, with big predators, with rhinos and elephants and whatnot. We work with schools on awareness. We have health programs, and we also pay compensation to villagers whose cattle have been killed by predators. And we do grassland and habitat restoration, and we have various targeted programs. So we've been at this for quite a while.
Conservation, awareness, health, working on livelihoods, 12,000 plus interim relief cases since
that's right. That's when that's one of our flagship programs, and it's very successful because you wouldn't believe it. If I always like to say that if there were tigers in America, there probably wouldn't be any left, because if you take wolves as an example, wolves are they've been few. Colorado and whatnot, they've been trying to reintroduce wolves and stuff, but it's always very controversial with ranchers, with farmers, because wolves kill livestock. But if you look at the data, wolves kill something like 0.02% of livestock, and yet they are vilified and hunted and whatnot. Tigers, in one landscape alone, Corbett Tiger Reserve in northern India, where we started, in that landscape alone, in the monsoon, especially when the cover becomes very dense and livestock, free-ranging livestock wander around the periphery, and tigers also wander further. Tigers kill something like 3 to 5 cows a day. Can you imagine? So often across India, when these things happen, the villager who loses his cow or his buffalo or something will poison the carcass, because the tiger comes back and then the tiger will die. So he gets rid of the predator, right? So the state is supposed to compensate the villagers to stop this from happening, but the state compensation comes very late. So we plug the gap by giving a certain percentage of the market value of the livestock on the spot. It sort of it takes away that urge to get rid of the predator, right? Which they coexist with. And it's been very successful. Touch wood, I must say, we have had no revenge killings for, something like 20 years now.
Great.
Ever since this program has been running. Yeah.
And I want to point out that you can follow Nirmal on Twitter at Karma Nomad and on Instagram at Karma_Nomad. And we have Diana was actually very pleased. She said she had no idea that you were a wildlife conservationist. So that's good that we shared a little bit of that insight. And she shared a link to your Instagram account. So thank you,
That's great.
Diana.
Thanks, Diana.
My mom is saying, Nirmal, you are multi-talented, proud of you and your work. And we do want to share one other bit in terms of Nirmal's background for you, just again to show that there's more to Nirmal that maybe meets the eye. You're involved with a group called the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime. Are you a crime fighter, Nirmal? Tell us about this.
No, not really crime fighter. So the Global Initiative is a Vienna-based NGO. It's a network-based, civil society-based organization. And what we do is we research global transnational organized crime. We cover pretty much most of the world. Africa, we look at weapons, we look at human smuggling, narcotics, all kinds of stuff. And we produce the Global Transnational Crime Index, which is a very authoritative publication. And we, put inputs into the United Nations. When called upon, we advise governments. We provide deep dive research outputs into global transnational organized crime, which is a growing threat, really. I mean, if you look at cybersecurity, for example, cyber scams, it's a massive and growing threat. So, and in many cases, as we know, transnational organized crime has a sort of symbiotic relationship with governments in power, right?
Sure.
And so this is a very crucial issue which international, Interpol and governments are constantly grappling with. And we have a network of over 700 people across the world, academics, activists, all of whom focus on some aspect or other on transnational organized crime. And they give us inputs, and we produce these sort of deep dive, in-depth reports. So that's what we do.
That's great. Before we move to the paper, and I'm going to use the paper in quotes today. I'll explain in just a moment. I want to give one quick announcement for Thursday. Many of you who've watched the show before know that I also host a show focusing on mental health. It's called Shining Light on Shadows, a candid conversation about mental health. Episode 23 is this week. Tim Fielder is going to be joining us and talking about processing trauma through EMDR. And we will learn more about that. EMDR is about eye movement. I lost the acronym, so I'm going to have to pull it up real quick. My apologies. EMDR stands for eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. It's a psychotherapy technique used to treat psychological trauma and other distressing memories. So we encourage you to join us. Tim has been a guest on the show on the New York Times Read Along before. He's an illustrator and an illustrator of the graphic history of hip hop, but he'll be talking about his own mental health journey and challenges. That's Thursday on Shining Light on Shadows, and we'll share the link for folks to join us. So with that, we'll turn our attention to the paper. I know it's a little bit later than we want, but when I say the paper, it's a paper in quotes because the hard copy did not get delivered to my door this morning. And it was the first time I've ever had that happen. It's come late a few times. I do want to give a quick shout out, and I hope everyone will send their appreciation in the comments. I had to wake my wife up at 7:45 in the morning when she doesn't need to wake up. Oh, the paper just got delivered. I didn't realize that. Let's go do that. Hold on one second, Nirmal. I'm going to just get the paper from the door.
Absolutely. I'm glad it came.
I was all ready to pull up a virtual edition of the paper, a replica edition. And I will just give Pam the shout out. She went to 4 different stores in the morning to get it while we were live. And then when she came back, the paper was there with on the doorstep. So let's go ahead and turn our attention to the paper, and we will continue to show. Of course, a lot of the conversation will focus on Trump because that is what is dominating the news. So let's go ahead and add that to the show, and we will start that. 1 second. There we go. There's the paper right there. So glorious to see that. Sometimes you take things for granted when you assume you're going to get it every day. So I mentioned that the U.S. Agency for International Development, the cuts there, was this big display story, dismantling USAID. They just have the pictures. They're actually taking down the signs. In fact, those are the letters from, if you can see, from the building. Workers on Friday removed the name of the U.S. Agency for International Development from its headquarters, which faces an uncertain future. I don't know. I can't even imagine. I mean, it's one thing to set the policy, and there's a judge that put an injunction on sending everybody home, right? All but 2,000 employees.
Mm-hmm.
But forget about that. Let's take the name off the building, right? There's no bigger statement than that. The lead story is young enforcers carry out blitz on bureaucracy. This is the Musk's engineers that we've seen some notes about, pursuing sensitive data and asking workers to justify jobs. And I remember seeing, I forget the name, but there was someone who had made very racist comments about Indians on social media, who was initially fired, and I think Elon hired him back. I don't know if you caught that latest on that.
I saw that. Mm-hmm.
And then this is looking at the Democrats in wilderness. Party searches for a way out. Democrats reevaluate politics of diversity. With the attack on DEI, we haven't talked about that. Democrats are not sure how to respond with that. So it's really interesting. Let's see, a couple of comments that have come in. Harish is saying this is a very educational conversation. Thank you, Harish. And Jonathan said he got an email this morning that delivery would be late. So I didn't get that notice. And I'm wondering what's gone. Maybe that's interesting. We'll have to check with our friends at the Times to see what happened. Deborah saying my print didn't have the travel section. So the 52 places to go was 2 weeks ago. Deborah, they don't do a standalone travel section anymore, unfortunately. But Patricia's asking, what is your preference, print or digital with the newspaper?
Digital.
Especially with your traveling, right?
Yeah, sort of. Yeah. I mean, I grew up with, print newspapers, but then I subscribe to so many things. I love the feel of a print newspaper still.
Sure.
But digital is just more convenient. You consume so much news all the time in my career. So,
The bottom of the page, bottom half, Hamas makes 3 Israeli hostages, captors before release. I hadn't realized that the plan was to release 3 hostages a week. That seems like what they've been doing over the last several weeks. A monument, a living room, and a stadium This is a New Orleans Dateline. The Super Bowl is in New Orleans. The Superdome is part of New Orleans' identity and hosts Sunday Super Bowl. There is a special section that I mentioned earlier that we have on our website. We'll take a quick look at it, but encourage you, if you want to get the special section, go to our website. You can go to Digimentors group /NYTReadalong to find that special section. Look for the Nirmal Ghosh, and then you can click through to download that section, and we'll run that as well for folks so that you know you can find it. Let's see here. There we go. That's the PDF is available on our website. We do have a comment from Instagram that I want to pull up. So Carrie is asking, what is the way forward? We'll get to that before the end of the show, certainly. There's so much that folks can do. I think Nirmal, and if you have thoughts on that, you're welcome to share them. But I would give you the out as a journalist that your job is to analyze the situation and kind of understand what's going on, not necessarily advocate for one position or another, or give advice necessarily. And I will say right off the bat, I have no idea what the way forward is. We still have to figure that out collectively. So that was on the front page. Let's go ahead and look at the front page of the different sections first in the time we have left. This is the sports section, and this is what we have available on our website. Again, even if you're not a sports fan, if you're into graphic design or sports journalism in general, I think it's worth checking out this cover image. One team pursues history, the other wants revenge. This is the Philadelphia Eagles against the Kansas City Chiefs. They're kind of playing off of that imagery. But I just think it's just interesting when they do a special section. It's a whole standalone sports section. And you typically in New York, you get a sports section with the paper as a standalone section. In the rest of the country, as a reminder, the New York Times is printed by 24 different printing plants around the country and for local delivery. And in DC, at least, the sports section is folded into the national section. It's only a couple of pages, never a standalone. So, this having this as a separate section is really interesting and special. This is a history of Super Bowl, all the back-to-back, and they use the Roman numerals, back-to-back 9 times, and three-peats 0. That's what the Chiefs are looking for. But just to give you a sense of how they put this together, the kind of coverage they have. This is what you can find on our website if you want the PDF. Articles about the coaching, some great photography as well. So just kind of give people a sense of that without going into the details. But definitely look for the Nirmal Ghosh show on our website to find that. So Sunday Business, driven to succeed in a world of gossip. Media and finance circles relish Emily Sundberg's newsletter. Feed me. Interesting. Nirmal, what sections do you focus on if you're reading? I mean, if you get beyond the politics, get beyond the front section. This is Battle of the Tech Titans seeking Trump's favor. I mentioned Sam Altman earlier. Where do you go to? Business, styles, arts and leisure? Do you have a preference?
Well, international news.
International news.
International news. Yeah, international news. Because I like to see the New York Times take on international news. The American media, I hate the term legacy media, but,
yes,
for want of a better word, we can use that term. The legacy media, papers like the New York Times. And by the way, Neil, it's great to actually see you again. I was saying that I love the physical copy of a paper. It's exclusive to you. You open it, the smell of the paper is great. It's just because of my job that I, have
of course
been existing on digital. I look at, of course, after local politics, political news, I look at international news because I want to see what foreign policy is what's going on in foreign policy, especially with regard to, as a correspondent for an Asian paper, especially with regard to Asia. And again, my other interests, I look at, if there's conservation news, I read that very closely, in terms of biodiversity and climate.
Well, let's take a look what the New York Times is doing for international coverage. One of the things to note is that they redesigned pages A2 and A3 about 2 years ago now. We had the editor on our show to explain the different sections they have. And one of the things that I think is interesting is always the dateline. They are really trying to show where Times journalists are reporting from around the world.
That's interesting.
And so this week's, they're highlighting, and they're obviously reporting from many more places than this, but San Francisco, Nova Scotia, Goma, Democratic Republic of Congo, major violence and I think there was an attempted coup there or successful rebellion, and then Colombo, Sri Lanka as well. So that's what you could find inside. So the international section, even as Serbia's economy surges, its leader's popularity wanes. Students' long march in opposition to Vučić. I'm guessing on the pronunciation. And so this is this picture above. Serbian students' 60-mile protest march. President Alexander Vučić, who is in the middle of a political crisis, clearing the wreckage after the lethal collapse of a canopy at the railway station in Novi Sad on November 1st. The 60-mile protest march reminds me of the Selma to Montgomery March during the Civil Rights Movement. We heard from the president CEO of Dietra Everson, the CEO of the John and Lillian Miles Lewis Foundation, and the Selma to Montgomery March was 54 miles, just to put that in perspective. And you did mention the civil rights history in the book as well,
right?
And John Lewis's passing.
Exactly.
I'm sorry.
Exactly. I mentioned that march and John Lewis. Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Why the cardboard is seen as favorite in Ecuador's election. That is interesting. An incumbent whom voters view as the candidate of change. So focus on Ecuador. Here's an article about India. Key win for Modi's party in India's capital region.
Yep.
There's
big news in
India. Delhi. There are several who've connected Modi, Trump, Bolsonaro, and in Hungary, I'm blanking on the name of the Viktor Orban, as authoritarian rulers. Yeah. Is there anyone else that we should add to that list, Nirmal?
Not yet, but could be soon in Europe.
Could be.
Yeah.
Here, another Ukrainian article where classes may be online only or in bomb shelters. So continued coverage. I remember it was 2 years now. So we're approaching what is it, 2 years in the spring, the invasion of Ukraine. It might be 3, in fact. That first, I remember we noted there were something like 45 days of stacked headlines in the New York Times. So not even today, but if you can imagine, a 2-line headline about Ukraine, 45 days in a row. We actually collected all of those front pages and ran that for one of our shows. It's pretty impressive. In disbelief, Africa reels again as USAID agency is dismantled. Ambassadors across Africa lobby to keep aid flowing. You made a reference to that earlier, how impactful USAID is, the cuts to USAID will be across the world. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, so basically, the USAID, I mean, it is in furtherance of American foreign policy, and that foreign policy is what John Mearsheimer called liberal hegemony, right? I mean, we want to help the world, change the world, help democratic movements, etc., and whatnot. So USAID often funded NGOs who are fighting for human rights, democracy, and so forth. And you notice not many governments are screaming about the dismantling of USAID. But several things can be true at the same time. USAID also funded stuff like UXO unexploded ordnance clearance in places like Laos and Cambodia. They have funded NGOs who are combating trafficking in wildlife. A whole plethora of health initiatives across the world, disaster relief, food security. So to throw the entire lot out, to suspend everything, has really caused tremendous disruption and is also sending a signal that the US is ceding. If you see it as a competition between the US and China, the US is losing a lot of credibility with this wholesale junking of the USAID program.
Yeah.
It's basically, China is in a position to take the lead, the moral lead on many factors now, with the US withdrawing and junking its USAID program. So it's quite unfortunate in that respect. I mean, yes, again, USAID does support inconvenient entities in certain authoritarian regimes who don't like it and all that, fine, whatnot. And it's an old policy agenda, the foreign policy of liberal hegemony, which Trump and the MAGA lot do not like. They do not like this sort of missionary zeal with which America goes abroad and preaches democracy and gets involved in wars and stuff, right? So USAID is part of that. But it's soft power. It is soft power, and it helps. It provides catalytic funding for a lot of very essential stuff, which are maybe not so prominent in the news, but critical. I mean, they have suspended unexploded ordnance clearing in Laos, and
Yes.
which is a leftover the Indochina War, and still takes people's legs get blown off in Laos, unexploded ordnance. So it's very unfortunate in that respect.
And I mentioned earlier, I worked on a USAID project in Egypt for 2 years. So we're focusing on family planning and reproductive health there. So
Right.
that's certainly important. I want to point out a few things real quick. First of all, as a reminder, we don't have a show scheduled for next week. It's President's Day weekend. No apostrophe per AP style. President's Day weekend. And one comment that I made when I wrote up the show, I'm waiting for that executive order from Trump to declare President's Day weekend to be honoring President Trump in the next few days. We'll see whether he follows through on that. There is a few more international articles that I thought we could highlight. Trump claiming bias against Afrikaners punishes South Africa. So that's another more foreign relations work. Trump wooing of Saudis is undercut by Gaza plan. So that's, again, his statements about Gaza, which apparently were not shared with anyone inside the government and State Department, in his aides. It's almost as if it was off the cuff, and he just went with it. So it's really is striking how he's approaching. A plan for demolition stoked strong reactions. In London, the Grenfell fire, tower fire, killed 72 people in 2017, and they're planning on tearing that down. And so here we do like to pay attention to the ads. Rocket, I think it's Rocket Mortgages, took out a center page ad. The American dream is dead? ? We've all heard people say it. And this is a home ownership platform. The American dream isn't dead. We're here to help you own it. But again, we just note that when companies still think it's worth it to get an ad in the New York Times, it means that the paper is not failing. And that's something that Trump said for years back when he was president. And then still more on the tariff fight, and Trump rhetoric are bruising U.S.-Canada bond. And I saw, I think, so this didn't make the print edition, but Trump is still talking about going through with his threats to increase tariffs on Canada and Mexico, even though last weekend they seemed to have, he seemed to have accepted the statements they made. My understanding is that they were promising things they'd already said they would do, and he said, okay, I won't do this, but now he's kind of back at it. So it's kind of it's a difficult thing to follow. The national stories as New Orleans spruces up, some locals grumble. This is a big article about the Superdome. Shout out to our friend Stephen Kaplan, who is actually in New Orleans working this weekend, covering a lot for one of his clients, wishing him well. Here's an interesting piece. You talk about the gun violence. This article, this is Michigan, if I'm not mistaken. Says from page 1. I don't remember seeing the behind a school shooting, a trial, a lawyer's own grief. What with parents on stand, that could be me. This is in Michigan. They decided to charge the parents in one of the school shooting incidents. So I thought that was interesting, and a lot of good coverage from the Times on that. Here's an interesting social media piece for Black educators. TikTok classes go viral, convening an unofficial online HBCU and reaching thousands of new students. We're a little bit past the hour. Nirmal, thank you for staying with us. It's 10 p.m. your time in Thailand, so we know it's getting late for you. We'll wrap up in just a second, but as we're looking at that headline on TikTok, what's your social media approach these days? What's your thoughts on Twitter? Are you using Threads or Blue Sky? What's your thought?
I still have the most followers on Twitter. I use Threads and Blue Sky both. I kind of like Blue Sky. I'm saying on Twitter, a lot of people fled from Twitter to Blue Sky, but I see that as, again, a separation of the two universes in America. And that's not a good thing. I stay on Twitter because I need to know what's going on. I need to know what people are thinking. You have to listen to everybody to understand what's going on. And it's good for information and, putting my own word out on my book and my other interests and whatnot, picking up news and stuff. So I stay on Twitter, and I'm posting more and more on Blue Sky. Threads a little bit, not so much, but I'm posting more and more on Blue Sky, and I like the Blue Sky platform.
Okay. Here's an interesting piece. Trump's first days in office. The New York Times is tracking the actions and significant statements of President Trump and his administration during the first 100 days.
That's a good graphic to look up.
Definitely a good graphic. And they have a QR code at the bottom. You can scan for more, for a complete list. This page will be updated daily online. That's really interesting. So if folks, I don't know if you can get the QR code through the camera lens, but we'll find that link and share it on that page. But this is definitely an interesting approach and a keepsake to a certain extent. I'm hoping that when we look back on this at some point, this will not be thought of as the good old days. We're hoping it won't get too much worse than what we're at now, but we just don't know. This is the obit section. Again, deep cuts to medical research funds could hobble university budgets. Another Trump directive. And then we have the obits here. And we'll wrap that up. So the other, the front page of the rest of the section, Sunday Opinion, actually almost mirrors some of the stuff that I was saying earlier in terms of citizenship. Asked nearly all federal workers to resign, ordered government to something, Panama Canal, renamed different things, restored. You can see kind of the way that what they're going for in terms of the design, but that's a really good, almost like a good summary. And the headline, Elections Have Consequences. We are witnessing a transformation of the presidency by David French, The Devastating Smallness of Trump's Foreign Policy by Ben Rhodes. The president doesn't need to use force. America is already kneeling. And a lot of people kneeled before he came in as well. Don't tune out Trump's chaos. Face it by the editorial board. So that's a really good opinion section to look at later. We saw the sports section. Sunday Business we looked at. Sunday Styles is a winning looks, still not champ, about a golden retriever. Kendrick Lamar on Arts and Leisure and Not Like Us. So a full breakdown about his diss track against Drake. This is the undercurrent. I don't know if you're following that, Nirmal, but this has been a huge thing in the world of hip hop over the last year. And he's performer at the Super Bowl later today. The book review, Pregnant with One Child and 295,233 words. What happens when the impulse to put pen to paper becomes extreme? And the magazine, The Joy of X. In an era plagued by sex negativity, only one generation seems immune, mine. So it's The Joy of X is a play on the joy of sex. And I thought I saw something online about Generation X is apparently having good sex. I want to close with Nirmal, because of your multi hyphenate, and one of your loves is poetry. It's been a long time since we've read the poem in the New York Times Magazine. So with your permission, a few minutes after the hour, I will close with reading the poem. If we have the poem in this week's issue. Sree, always like to say that people should not read poems cold. They should be read by the poet, because they understand the where the emphasis should be and the timing, etc. What is your thought on that as we flip through this article on Gen X and sex? I'm not seeing the poem, so there may not be a poem this week for us. I'm sorry to disappoint you. Let's see if it's Greenland letters. No poem in this week's issue, Nirmal.
Oh, that's a pity.
My apologies.
That's a pity.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But I want to thank you again for joining us, and I will come on screen in just a moment. We will wrap up today's show and just ask you to offer some final thoughts about Backlash. We'll put the book up on the screen again. Get my microphone back. And again, for folks who may have missed it earlier, if you have a chance, you can scan the QR code. Backlash is Donald Trump and the Remaking of America. This great quote blurb from Stephen Herman. Nirmal Ghosh provides a clear overview of how and why the United States has gone from Obama to Trump to Biden and back to Trump. It's a concise but compelling explanation that serves as an essential primer for readers seeking lucidity ahead of an uncertain and possibly unprecedented period of geopolitical upheaval. Nirmal, final thoughts about Backlash and your coverage of Trump?
Yeah, thank you, Stephen, for saying that. In fact, look, I think that we are in, as Steve says, a period of great geopolitical upheaval. America has shown that under Trump, has shown that it is not going to underwrite the so-called international order anymore. So this is a huge wake-up call for the global community, for the international community, who has realized that they cannot rely on America the way they have for several decades, since the end of World War II and since the end of the Cold War. So it's a wake-up call. Maybe it's a necessary wake-up call. A lot of countries are going to be making a lot of adjustments. What happens in America is this massive planet, of course, in the solar system, which exerts an influence on all the other planets. So what happens in America is a lesson to the world and exerts an influence. If America, one of the worries I have about the future, which you referred to briefly, is that America will swing widely between right and left and will, tear apart. But then on the good side, America remains dynamic. The economy remains dynamic. It remains an engine of innovation, a hub of creativity. It's not going to, you cannot write off America in any sense of the word. But the rise of China is a huge psychological challenge for the American foreign policy and strategic establishment. There's yet to come to grips with it. America internally is going through massive upheavals. Trump has Congress pretty much on his side. And the Supreme Court is conservative. He's got the Supreme Court judgment on immunity from prosecution for presidents' executive actions in office and all that. But he's a one-term president, most likely. And he is also an older person. And the MAGA movement is centered on a single charismatic personality, Donald Trump. What happens if he's not there anymore? What happens to that movement? Will another leader step up? What will the Democrats do? All this stuff is still in flux, and we are in for a really disturbing and turbulent time ahead. So we really have to keep calm and carry on, basically, and adapt as best we can.
Keep calm and carry on. I think that is great advice coming from the British from World War II. Relevant today, 60 years later. I want to get to some of the comments that we weren't able to get in while I was working with the paper. Let me see here. Scrolling through, we had Sushanto saying in Oval Office now is a real-time vampire. And on YouTube, Dr. Tachi saying good morning, guest on our show several weeks ago. Dr. Tachi, thank you for joining us. Kavri says she'll be following your writing from now on. Thank you for an interesting conversation. So you have at least one fan from today.
Thank you, Kavri.
And let's see. We have Michael Bay. Deborah says was hired by the Secret Service to produce a recruiting ad to be unveiled tonight at the Super Bowl. And that Trump amends the 60 Minutes lawsuit and demands $20 billion. So that is interesting. And let's see, Edward Jeffrey, his take on this might be a little different. The divide got so bad, one party burned down buildings for years. Endless riots and prosecuting their political opponents. The electorate, including deep blue counties, retaliated. So that looks like it's an alternate perspective, which is fine. At least for what it's worth, it's a respectful presentation of that alternate, because you don't always get that in conversations like this. So Edward, thank you for watching. Shashanto said Modi's win in India's capital is an absolute voter suppression case in many ways. ECI got directed by the present party rulings, the vampire in the prime minister's office. I will say Edward was concerned he had stepped into the bubble, into a different bubble here. And I will say to that, that we have not shied away from expressing strong opinions around President Trump. We welcome other conflicting opinions as long as they're shared respectfully, which you did, Edward. So thank you for doing that. On Instagram, we had a couple of thoughts. Wayne Camadoy, the art director, and there are a couple of people who made references to maybe the weather impacted delivery of the paper this morning. I wasn't seeing weather here in DC, but Wayne says kudos to his carrier on time in the storm. So New York must be getting hit. We have Alex Tarquinio watching through the Delegates Lounge, watching, saying it's a really timely episode. Alex has a really great podcast called the Delegates Lounge, which folks should check out. And then what else do we have just before we close? Let's see. Naomi is reminded of a lyric from Monty Python, sums up our national mood. Always look on the bright side of life. That's one thought. And Rose was hopeful about the poem. I'm sorry we could not deliver today. Diana says, poets skilled at cadence are mesmerizing to listen to. Even if I don't like the poetry, I love the rhythm. What's your take on that, Nirmal? For someone to read a poem that they're not familiar with, that's not their own, to read it cold, is there's still value in that, or you really should understand the poem first before reading it out loud?
No, I think reading it cold, there's a lot of value to it. I think if the poem makes a connection, and it's very interesting, the cadence, mentioning of cadence. I think cadence is very important. Poetry can take many forms, but to me, cadence is important. And
Sure.
Reading it cold, if you identify with it, if it speaks to you, then it's fine.
Rose made a comment. Read Nirmal Ghosh's poetry. See my post above. Rose, if you can put that link back in, I didn't see that post. So we definitely want to share Nirmal's poetry if we can. Kovri says a good wake-up call. The rest of the world had all its eggs in what is now a basket full of holes. Rose is quoting you saying, keep calm and carry on. So I think that's a great way to end. Again, we had a great conversation with Nirmal Ghosh. Next week, we will be taking off for the President's Day holiday. Not yet named for President Trump, but we'll see what happens this week. It is usually for President Washington and Lincoln. And then after that, we'll be back with Deborah Kerr sharing her experience on her trip to National Geographic sponsored trip to Antarctica. You won't want to miss that show. Again, thank you very much for spending your Sunday with us. Sorry that we went a little long, but there was so much to cover. Patricia says thank you to the New York Times Read Along team and to our special guest. And here is the link that Rose shared. And I will pull this up, Nirmal, with your permission. You know, really pushing your bedtime, but Wild Cranes.
Oh, yeah.
Poems by Nirmal Ghosh.
Oh, you found them, yeah.
So she found that and shared that in the comments. So this is the calligraphy, I guess. Wild Cranes, 4 poems by Nirmal Ghosh, translated into Chinese by Liu Ivy Chen. I assume that's who was in that picture, right? That we showed.
That's right.
Earlier?
Yeah. That's from Lit Magazine, I think. My poems also. All the poems from that show are also available on my personal website, nirmalghosh.com.
Nirmalghosh.com as well.
Yeah.
Can we ask you to read this first part?
How long can one gaze into the green hills between curtains of rain? The dribble of water down the gutter measures our minutes on this earth.
And you see some of the calligraphy. And then this is the second stanza, or second poem?
Want me to read it?
Yeah, please. We'll end with this.
Okay. The wind rattles the shuttered house. The late afternoon brings a spatter of rain. Inside, the rooms are bare. In the dark, there are no shadows. But once a little girl laughed here. She threw open the windows and let in the rain.
That is the benefit of having the poet read their own work. Thank you so much, Rose. Thank you, Rose, for sharing that link. And she says, timely and interesting conversation. Thank you, Neil and Nirmal. And it's great to hear you read. And Dr. Tachi says, what gorgeous words. So thank you, Nirmal, for being so generous with your time. Thank you to our audience for sticking with us. Again, Sree Sunday New York Times Read Along is produced in partnership with Scroll and Scroll Global, one of India's most important news sites. And Kavri, another writer, very beautiful. Looking forward to reading your poetry. Thank you for a great show. With that, we will let you get back to your Sunday. If you're in the U.S., you have the rest of the day in front of you. If you're overseas, hopefully you'll be getting to sleep relatively soon. Thank you, and see you in 2 weeks.
Thank you very much to all of you. Thank you, Neil. Thank you. And thank you to Sree as well. Thank you very much. This was a lovely conversation. Thank you. So such a pleasure and a privilege. Thank you. All the best to everyone out there. Stay well.
You're welcome. Bye-bye.